Everyone started shouting out questions and making suggestions. Everyone wanted to be involved in the crisis. "They need water," and "put him in the recovery position," and "hold his nose." I thought all the advice was stupid. You could see the air bubbling out of the hole in Sten's side, so his lungs were obviously completely destroyed. And anyway, you couldn't imagine anyone looking more dead. His eyes were open, but you could only see the whites. Carl could hardly be put in the recovery position while he was rolling around and screaming. The only person who was talking sense was Sal. She was shouting at everyone to get back and shut up. No one took any notice, though. I pushed my way backwards through the crowd, which was easy, as most people were trying to get closer to the Swedes. As soon as I was out of the circle, I began thinking a lot more clearly. 2 realizations hit me at once. Number 1 was that I now had a chance to have a cigarette. Number 2 was Christo. Nobody had even mentioned the third Swede, who might have been on the beach, wounded, and waiting for help to arrive. I hesitated for a couple of moments, then I made my decision and ran down the longhouse, passing the few squid sufferers who were still too ill to see what was going on. Just before I ran out of the door, I lit a cigarette and shouted, "Christo!" But I didn't wait to see if anyone had heard me. Through the jungle, I cursed myself for not having grabbed a torch. I couldn't see much apart from the red light from my cigarette. On the beach, however, there was enough moonlight to see clearly. Across the sand were deep tracks where Carl had dragged Sten. He seemed to have reached the beach about 20 metres from the path that led to the clearing. Christo, I noted, couldn't have reached the shore. In the light from the moon, the sand was silver. If he'd been there, I'd have seen him. I took a deep breath and sat down near the water, wondering what to do. Christo wasn't on the beach, and I hadn't passed him on the path from the camp, unless I'd walked over him without realising it. So he was in the lagoon, the open sea, or the cave that led to the sea. If he was in the open sea, he was probably dead. If he was in the lagoon, he was either on a rock or floating face down. If he was in the cave, he would be at one of its 2 entrances, maybe too tired or injured to swim through the underwater passage. The shark could be anywhere. "I bet he's in the cave," I said, and lit another cigarette to help me think. When I reached the cave, I swam to the place where the passage went below the water level. Then I took a lungful of air and dived underwater. Every few strokes I stopped and felt around to make sure I wasn't accidentally going down the side passage to the air pocket like I had before. When I came out of the cave into the open sea, I looked around for Christo. I shouted his name without a lot of hope because the moonlight was bright enough for me to see that he wasn't there. I sat down on a rock and wondered what I should do next. Maybe Christo was only slightly injured, I said to myself. Maybe he swam through the underwater passage with Carl, helping him with Sten, but something happened. Maybe he's in the air pocket. I stood up, filled my lungs with air, and dived back into the water. I found the side passage to the air pocket on my 3rd attempt. I surfaced in the air pocket and took a deep breath. "Here," said a quiet voice. "Christo! Thank God! I've been—" "Richard, help me." "Yes, I'm here to help." I pushed out my hands and touched Christo. He moaned. "Are you badly hurt?" "I have some injury." "You have to swim. We've got to get out of this air pocket. I'll swim ahead using my arms, and you'll have to hold onto my legs and try to kick. Understand?" His voice sounded fainter. "I understand." "OK, Christo," I said. "I think I know which direction to take." Within a few strokes, I realised that the passage was not the one leading back to the original cave. About 10 metres along we found a second air pocket, and 10 metres further on we found another. Then we came up into fresh air. I could see real stars and real sky. I laid the exhausted Christo out on a flat rock. "You're okay now, Christo," I said quietly. "You're okay." Chapter 7. Unwelcome Newcomers. The atmosphere in the camp had become very tense. The divisions that I'd noticed when I got back from the rice run seemed to be getting worse. People had separated into different groups. There was Bug's group, the carpenters and most of the gardeners. The first afternoon after the shark attack, I found them all sitting in the centre of the clearing in a circle, smoking dope and chatting quietly. Then there were other smaller groups. There were the people in my old fishing group and Keaty. I included myself in this group. But there was also Jed, and I included myself with him as well. Then there were the cooks. And finally, there were Sal and Carl. Sal was trying extremely hard to get on with everyone, and Carl seemed to be in a world of his own after the shark incident. This, then, was the politics in the camp, and we all had to deal with the situation in our own way. If it sounds complicated, that's because it was. After work one afternoon, I walked over to the hospital tent. It was actually the Swede's tent, but Sten was dead and Carl had started living on the beach, so I'd begun calling it the hospital tent. Jed had been looking after Christo there since I'd found him in the cave. "Back early today," said Jed when I went into the tent. He sounded very tired and was sweating heavily. I got hungry and needed a cigarette. I looked at Christo. "How is he?" Jed rubbed his eyes. "He's getting worse. He's got a bad fever and is unconscious most of the time. When he's awake, he's in a lot of pain. To tell you the truth, I'm getting seriously worried about him." I frowned. Christo looked okay to me. Apart from a single cut on his arm, his only wound was a large bruise on his stomach where the shark had smashed into him. "I mean," Jed continued, "that bruise should be getting better, shouldn't it?" I leant over to take a closer look at Christo's stomach. "It's blacker than it was. Not so purple. I think that means it's healing." "I'm not sure," Jed said in a worried voice. "Well, I'm going to get some food now and find Etienne and Francoise," I said. "OK, leave me a cigarette, will you? And come back later. Nobody comes in to see if I'm OK, apart from you. I think they're avoiding having to see Christo. Pretending it hasn't happened, maybe." I threw him a packet of cigarettes. Well, it's not easy for anyone. Sten's body is lying behind the longhouse, and you can smell it through the walls. Jed looked at me sadly. "Well, we're going to bury him tomorrow morning, by the waterfall." It was getting close to 6 o'clock when I reached the beach. I found Etienne and Keaty sitting on the sand discussing Carl. "He's gone completely mad," said Keaty. "No, he hasn't," said Etienne in an angry voice. "He's in a state of shock. We should take him to Comprehension." Then he got up and started walking away. I'd obviously arrived in the middle of something, and I wasn't happy at all with the idea that my friends had been arguing. "Was Etienne being serious about Comprehension?" I asked Keaty. He nodded. "He's been saying it all day. He says he's going to discuss it with Sal." "But he must know we can't take Carl to Comprehension. What would we say?" "He is a friend of ours who's been attacked by a shark and had a nervous breakdown on our secret beach. See you." "He thinks we could just take him there and leave him on a beach." "That's ridiculous. Even if he didn't tell people about our beach, how would we know that he got looked after? They might just ignore him." I shook my head. No, the best thing for Carl is for him to stay here. I've been telling Etienne that all day, but he wants to take Sten to Comprehension as well, said Kitty. Sten? But he's dead. What would be the point of... His family. Etienne thinks we have to let them know what's happened to their son. I smiled in disbelief. Yeah, and meanwhile we'd definitely get discovered. It's the worst idea I've ever heard. After all the discussion about Carl, I decided I ought to go and see him myself. Or that's what I told Kitty. Really, I was just interested in finding Françoise, whom I'd hardly seen over the past few days. Following the misunderstood kiss, I hadn't wanted to give Etienne any reasons to be suspicious. I found Françoise about 400 metres away, sitting near Carl. When she saw me, she ran over to me, smiling. "Richard," she said, "thank you." I paused. "What for?" "For helping me when I was sick. You were so kind." "Françoise, it was nothing." She smiled, then looked at me straight in the eyes and laughed. "You kissed me." "I thought you were sleeping." "I was. Etienne told me the next day." "Oh, well, I hope you don't mind. It was sort of complicated." "Of course I do not mind. But why do you say it was complicated?" "Well, complicated is probably the wrong word. The kiss wasn't." I stopped and then tried again. "I'm not sure what Etienne told you, but I was kissing you because you were so ill, and then when I'd started it was hard to stop." "Well, I expect Etienne thought it was, you know, a sexy kiss." Françoise laughed again. Then she leant over and gave me a little kiss on the cheek. "Was it a sexy kiss?" "No," I replied, lying. "Of course not." "So there is no problem? Not complicated?" "I'm glad you understand." "Always," she said. "I always understand." For a moment, we looked at each other. Then the moment was over, broken by Françoise as she turned to look at Carl. The next day, at Sten's funeral, we all circled the grave that had been dug near the waterfall. Sal said a few words, talking about Sten's commitment to the camp and how much we'd all miss him. Then one of the cooks talked about how Sten always caught big fish, which kept people's stomachs full. Someone else told us how Sten was always ready to play football on Sunday and how fairly he played. When we began filling the grave with earth, several people started crying. Bugs planted a wooden cross on the grave with Sten's name on it. As we all turned to go back to the camp, Sal stopped us. "Wait," she called out. "I don't want anyone leaving yet. There's something important I need to say, and I want everyone to hear it." People stopped, looking puzzled, and waited for Sal to continue. "Okay, I'd like to start by asking everyone to sit down so you can all see me." We slowly sat down on the grass. Sal waited until we were all settled, then nodded. "I want to talk about the atmosphere in the camp. I'm going to talk about it because I've got no choice. I'm going to talk about it because no one else seems willing to do so." No one said anything. "The way I see things is like this," Sal went on. "We've had 2 disasters over the past week. First, there was the food poisoning, and then we had the terrible tragedy with the shark. For these reasons, the atmosphere in the camp has been bad. It's understandable. We're all human. But it ends here. It ends with the burial of a friend, so that something positive will come out of his death. Now, dates don't mean much on the beach, but I keep a calendar, and it may interest you to know that the date today is September the 11th. As a matter of fact, it interested me a lot to hear the date was September the 11th, because it meant it was almost 5 months since I'd left England. That means that our special beach festival is in 3 days' time. As most of you know, the festival is our birthday, and we celebrate it every year. As she said this, Sal looked rather sad. To be honest, I haven't been looking forward to this year's festival much. Without Daffy, I don't mind telling you that it will feel very strange. But after the trouble we've been through, particularly losing Sten, I now feel it's exactly what we need. It will remind us what we are and why we're here. As it's our birthday, it will mark a fresh start. Sal paused for a moment, clearly lost in thought. Then her face hardened and she continued. Okay, so that's it. I hope you all listened hard. Tomorrow we'll start getting ready for the party. When we got back to the camp, I noticed that the mood had improved. I was half expecting people to sit down in their groups and begin analysing the morning's events. But within a few minutes, everyone had left for work and the clearing was empty. It must have been after midday before I checked on Zeph and Sammy through the binoculars. Jed had gone back to the hospital tent to look after Christo, so I was on my own again. I got to our usual rock, sat down, and put the binoculars up to my face. Quickly, I looked along the beach. Nothing. Where were they? Oh my God, I shouted when I finally saw them. There, on a raft in the sea, sailing slowly towards our island, were Zeph, Sammy, and the 3 Germans. I raced back to the camp, wondering who I should tell about the raft first, Jed or Sal. I decided to go and find Jed. I noticed the bad smell as soon as I climbed into the hospital tent. It was sweet and sour. You get used to it, Jed said quickly. In a couple of minutes, you won't smell a thing. Don't go. I pulled up the neck of my t-shirt to cover my nose and mouth. I wasn't going to go. Not one person has come in all day. Can you believe it? Not one person. He turned to look at me, and I frowned with concern when I saw his face. Although his suntan was still deep, his face looked grey, as if his blood had lost its colour. I've been listening to them out there since 2 o'clock. They've been playing football. None of them have been thinking about Christo. I nodded, although actually I was only half listening. He clearly needed to talk, but I had to tell him about the raft. Sammy and Zeph would arrive on our island before nightfall. At the earliest, that meant they could start the journey across the island tomorrow morning and could reach the beach by tomorrow afternoon. Christo moved, and for a second his eyes opened. Jed wiped his forehead gently. How long will he be like this? I asked. 2 days. Well, that's good. If Christo's better in 2 days, he can talk to Carl and... Jed shook his head. No, he said quietly. You don't understand. Christo's not getting better. In 2 days, he'll be dead. He's dying. But how do you know? Jed pulled back the sheet that covered Christo's body. Feel there, he said, pointing to Christo's stomach. The entire area of his stomach was almost completely black and as hard as a rock. He's been bleeding inside, said Jed. Bleeding badly. I couldn't be sure until last night. Who else knows? Just you and Sal. And Bugs too, probably. I talked to Sal today. She said that now we've started to get things back to normal, nobody must find out. Jed stroked Christo's shoulder before pulling back the sheet. We sat in silence for a minute or two, watching his shallow breathing. It was strange that, after Jed had explained, it was obvious to me that he was dying. The smell I'd noticed as I'd entered the tent was the smell of death. I suddenly remembered the raft and broke the silence. Zeph and Sammy have built a raft. They're on their way. Jed didn't move. If they get to the beach, he said, they'll see Christo die. Everything here will be destroyed. And that was all. I left the tent and walked close to the longhouse entrance, past where Sal sat talking with Bugs, and continued along to the beach path. At the first corner, I stopped, leaning against a tree, and lit a cigarette. Sal appeared almost at once. "Something's happened," she said. "What is it?" Before I could reply, she said, "They're on their way, aren't they?" "Yes." "Oh my God! When do you think they'll get here?" "Sometime tomorrow afternoon, if they don't get frightened by the dope guards," I answered. "They built a raft." "Have you told anyone about this?" "Only Jed." "Okay, Richard. It looks like we have a slight problem here. But you don't think they can possibly get here until tomorrow, do you?" "No." "Then I'm going to think about this overnight. I'll give you my decision on what we do about them in the morning." I put my head into the hospital tent before going to bed in the longhouse. Jed was fast asleep, but Christo was half awake. He even recognized me. "Richard," he whispered. "Yes," I whispered back. "How are you feeling?" "I feel very bad, Richard. Very bad." "I know, but you'll be better soon." "Stan?" "You'll see him in the morning." "My chest." "Close your eyes." "Very bad." "Shh, now." He nodded, and at last his eyes shut. "Have good dreams," I said, maybe too quietly for him to hear. I left the tent door open when I left. I wanted to stop Jed breathing too much of that dying air. Chapter 8. Paradise to Hell. Sal gave me my instructions at 5:45 the next morning. I had to follow Zeph, Sammy, and the 3 other rafters across the island. When they reached the top of the waterfall, she wanted me to stop them and tell them to leave the island at once. If that didn't work, I had to prevent them from going any further in any way I could until Christo was dead. After that, we would work out whether to let them into the camp or keep them out. By setting off early, I was hoping that Zeph and Sammy would still be with their raft. Finding them would be a lot harder if they'd already entered the jungle. I was also assuming that they'd have landed on the same stretch of beach where Etienne, Francoise and I had first arrived. The early morning effort was worth it. The rafters were still on the beach. Even though I'd been watching them for weeks, it was a shock to see the group so near. It confirmed that it actually was Zeph and Sammy we'd been watching, and therefore that I was responsible for their presence on the island. I still hadn't worked out what I was going to say to Sal about the map. From where I was lying, about 20 metres from where they sat, I could see only 4 of them. The 5th was hidden behind the raft. One of the Germans I could see was a boy, the other a girl. With some satisfaction, I saw that the girl was pretty, but not as pretty as Francoise. No one on the beach was as pretty as Francoise. The guy looked very similar to Bugs. They could have been brothers. I disliked him immediately. Eventually, I managed to see the fifth person in the group, another girl, and annoyingly, I couldn't criticise her looks. She had a lovely figure, very long brown hair, and an attractive, quiet laugh that travelled across the sand to where I lay. The rafters didn't make the same mistake as I had with Etienne and Francoise, walking along the coast before realising that the only way to get to the other side of the island was to go inland. But later, they made a far more serious mistake. Actually, I knew they were going to make the mistake even before it happened. Firstly, they hadn't hidden their raft properly, and secondly, they chatted loudly as they walked. To me, this clearly suggested one thing. They were entirely unaware of any need for caution. When they arrived at the dope field, not one of them realised they were in a field. Sammy shouted out, "Man, I've never seen so much dope. There's more dope here than I've ever seen." He started tearing big handfuls of leaves off the plants and throwing them in the air. Then the other four started shouting and throwing leaves in the air too. They looked like million-dollar bank robbers throwing money around, completely out of control. It was 10 o'clock. The guards would have been on duty for 2 hours at least, and if they hadn't heard the rafters crashing through the jungle, they'd certainly hear them now. By chance, I was hiding in the same bush that I'd hidden in with Etienne and Francoise. Watching Zeph and Sammy was like watching myself. What could have happened 6 months ago if Etienne hadn't acted so sensibly? It looked like the problem with our uninvited guests was going to be solved, and I was also going to find out what happened when the dope guards caught someone. Better than that, I was actually going to see it. I wouldn't want anyone to think that I was without pity for them. I didn't want Zeph and Sammy on the island, and I knew it would be convenient if they disappeared. But it didn't have to be this way. The ideal would be they arrived, I had a couple of days following them as they found their way across the island, then they gave up at the waterfall and went back home. I would have had some fun, and there'd have been no spilt tears and no spilt blood. Zeph bled like a pig. When the guards appeared, he'd begun walking straight over towards them like they were old friends. To me, it was a crazy thing to do, but that's what he did. He still hadn't realised what was going on, even though all the guards were pointing their guns at him. Maybe he thought they were part of our community, or maybe he was so shocked that he just didn't realise how much trouble he was in. But it didn't matter what he thought. As soon as he got close, one of the guards smashed him hard in the face. I wasn't surprised. The guard looked very nervous and just as confused by Zeph's strange behaviour as I was. After that, there were a few seconds of silence while the guards and the rafters stared at each other across the top of the dope plants. It seemed as if each of the two groups was as shocked as the other. The rafters were having to make a huge mental adjustment. Paradise to hell in a few seconds. The dope guards seemed amazed that anyone could be stupid enough to walk into their field and start tearing leaves off their plants. It occurred to me that most of the guards were more like country boys than experienced fighters. I think in some ways it made them seem more dangerous. Maybe someone more experienced wouldn't have panicked and smashed Zeph's face in. Don't people say that the only thing more dangerous than a man with a gun is a nervous man with a gun? It was certainly true in this case. When the short period of staring was over, the guards began violently beating the rafters. I suppose they might have beaten them to death right there, but another group of guards suddenly arrived, and this group appeared to have a boss. I'd never seen him before. He was older than the others. One word from him, and the beating stopped. "Who are you?" he said, in English, very loudly and clearly. A difficult question. What do you say? Do you formally introduce yourself? Do you say, no one? Do you beg for your life? I thought Sammy handled it very well, considering that, like Zeph, he'd just had his front teeth knocked out. We're travellers from Comprehension, he replied. We were looking for some other travellers. We made a mistake. We didn't know this was your island. The boss nodded, not unkindly. Very big mistake. Please, we're very sorry. You alone now? And friends here now? We're alone. We were looking for a friend. We thought he was here. And we know we made a mistake. Why you look for friend here? Our friend gave us a map. What map? I can show. You can show me map later. Please, we're very sorry. Yes, I know about you being sorry. We'd like to go. We could leave your island now, and we wouldn't tell anyone about anything. Yes, you tell no one. I know about that. Sammy tried to smile. All his remaining teeth were bright red. Will you let us go? Please. Ah, the boss smiled back. You can go. Thank you, sir. Thank you. I promise you, we won't tell any. You can go with us. With you? You go with us now. No, Sammy began to protest. Please wait, we made a mistake. We're very sorry. We won't tell anyone. The German guy started to get up, holding his arms in the air. We will not speak, he cried. We will not speak. The boss stared at the German, then spoke quickly to the guards. 3 of them moved forward and tried to lift Zeph by the arms. He began to struggle. Another guard stepped forward and hit him in the stomach. The other rafters began screaming. One of the German girls tried to run away, but the guards caught her and started beating her. I covered my face in my hands as the guards began dragging their prisoners away. The cries and screams were gradually replaced by jungle noises. I slowly stood up and set off on my way back to the camp. It wasn't an easy journey. My head ached, my legs felt unsteady, and I kept falling over. Looking back, it seems obvious that I'd suffered a terrible trauma and was in a hurry to leave an area which still felt heavy with screams. But that wasn't how I saw it at the time. I only thought about the importance of getting back to the camp and telling Sal about what had happened. After a few minutes, I heard a loud noise from somewhere in the jungle. I froze. Within 5 or 6 seconds, the silence was exploded by a burst of gunfire. The noise tore through the trees with shocking loudness. Jesus Christ, I whispered to myself. It's happened. They've been shot. I felt violently sick. I imagined the rafters' bodies, their shirts covered in blood, their limbs twisted. As I made my way down to the waterfall, I couldn't decide if it had all gone wrong or if it had all gone right. It was true that our problem with the new arrivals was over and that Sal would never find out that I'd given Zeph and Sammy the map. But that didn't seem to change the way I was feeling. Struggling to walk, I wanted to scream out loud. My brain couldn't cope with what had just happened. It refused to even try. Sal was waiting for me beneath the waterfall. What the hell happened? She said, more angry than anxious. Why did I hear gunshots? The rafters, I said. They've been killed? Yes. I saw them get caught by the guards, and then later I heard the firing. You didn't see it? No. What happened when they were caught? They were beaten badly. Badly enough to scare them? Maybe just a message? Worse. Then they got taken away somewhere. Dragged. Dragged? You didn't follow? No. What next? The shooting. I see. Sal stared at me. Badly beaten, you say? Very badly. You feel responsible for their deaths? I thought about this before replying, not wanting Sal to discover my connection to Zeph and Sammy at this late stage. It was their decision to come here, I said eventually. They made a lot of noise in the jungle. It was their fault. Sal nodded. Others may have heard the shooting. What will you tell them? Nothing. I think Etienne might know that Christo's dying. He's being difficult again. I won't tell Etienne, I interrupted. I won't tell Francoise or Kitty or anyone. Except Jed. You know I'll tell Jed. Of course I do, Richard, Sal said. But it's nice of you to ask permission. Then she suddenly turned and walked away. She didn't even wait for me, or hear me whisper, actually, I wasn't asking for your permission. I didn't follow Sal back to the camp because I didn't want to see anyone yet. In fact, I didn't want to do anything much, except maybe sleep. I wanted to get away from my brain that was still making me want to scream. The trouble was, if I slept, I'd dream, and I knew I'd have terrible dreams. In the end, I talked to myself. Walking near the waterfall, I asked my mind to leave me alone for a while. I was trying to find some peace and quiet, but it didn't work. So I tried to get interested in a pretty flower or the patterns on a tree, but that failed too. No place to avoid thinking. I realised this eventually and started to walk straight into the jungle so that I could reach the beach without crossing the clearing. I'll keep this short, absolutely limited to what I can remember. My memory of the next few minutes isn't very good, no doubt a result of the morning's trauma and my state of mind. The rafters are dead, I said to Carl when I'd found him on the beach. Christo will be dead within 48 hours. All our problems are over except one. It's time you got sane. Carl looked at me. Or he looked through me. Or he wasn't looking at anything at all. I didn't really care. I took a step towards him, and as I did so, he hit out viciously at my legs. The blow hurt, so I hit him back. I sat on his chest, my knees against his upper arms, trying to push a handful of rice into his mouth. He made sounds, probably words. "That's right," I shouted. "I'm making you better now." His fingers went round my neck. I pushed them away. I think I may have lost the rice in the struggle. I think I may have been holding sand. I assume I closed my eyes. Instead of Carl's face, I have a mental picture of a red-brown blanket. Nothingness. So I think I must have closed my eyes. Then a blue blanket, then a red-brown blanket again. I sat up. Carl was 20 or more metres down the beach, running like crazy. Amazed that he could still have so much strength after days of starvation, I leapt to my feet and raced after him. Down the beach, through the trees, up the path, into the clearing. I'd nearly caught him. I was just going to get hold of his hair when I tripped over something and he escaped. I got up quickly. Several people were standing nearby, watching. "Catch him!" I shouted. But they were too shocked to react. "You fools! He's getting away!" A few seconds later, he'd disappeared. I fell down on my knees and started banging the ground with my fists. A light hand touched my shoulder. I looked round and saw Françoise leaning over me, and behind her a group of curious people. "Richard," she said anxiously, "are you okay?" "Yes," I began, and then stopped, trying to remember what had happened. "I think Carl attacked me." "You are hurt?" said Françoise. "I'm fine." "Why did he do it?" I really don't know." I shook my head in desperation. I didn't feel at all ready to cope with these questions. Maybe he thought I was a fish. He was a fisher and he's mad." Then everyone started talking at once. "I should have caught him," someone said. "He ran so close." "I saw the look in his eye. He looked right at me. It was awful." "We should catch him and tie him up." Only one voice disagreed. Etienne's. "This is impossible," he shouted above the others. "I do not believe Carl would attack Richard. I do not believe it. I was with him this morning." The others stopped talking and listened. "This morning I was with him for 1 hour. 1 hour, and he ate rice with me. He was getting better. I know he would not attack anyone." I frowned in disbelief. "Are you saying I'm a liar?" Etienne hesitated, then turned away from me, talking to the others. "For 1 hour I was with him. He said my name. For the first time in a week he talked. I know he was getting better." Suddenly I began to agree with Etienne, just wanting to get away. "Yes, Etienne's right. It may have been my fault. I could have frightened him." Sal interrupted sharply. "No, I'm afraid Carl has become dangerous. This morning I also went to see him, and he tried to hit me too." Surprised, I studied her expression hard. Was she lying or telling the truth? "Luckily, Bugs was there to stop him. I should have warned you, but I was trying to work out the best way to deal with him. I didn't want to spoil our birthday celebration with more bad news. I was stupid, but things had been going so well." "Well, we can't have someone as dangerous as that just wandering around," someone said. "Something will have to be done." Everyone nodded, and for some strange reason, I felt they were all nodding at me. "I know," said Sal. "You're quite right." "No!" cried Etienne desperately, his arms out in front of him as if he was begging us to listen. "Please, please, everybody must listen. Carl is not dangerous. He needs help. I think maybe we could take him to Copa." This time it was Françoise who made him stop by walking away. He couldn't speak as he watched her marching across the clearing. Then he ran after her, still holding his arms out in front of him. When it was dark, I went over to the hospital tent. If possible, conditions were even worse inside the tent than they had been before. The terrible smell was the same, but now there was blood everywhere. Blood from Christo's stomach on the sheets, all over the floor, and across Jed's arms and chest. "Jesus Christ," I said. "What's been going on in here?" Jed turned towards me. He looked terrible. "Do you have any good news?" he asked in a low voice. "I'm tired of bad news now. I only want to hear good news." I paused. "I've got some news. Zeph and Sammy are dead. Shot by the dope guards." "Dead," Jed said without emotion. "Aren't you pleased? Not pleased, I mean relieved, in a way. It means the beach is safe. Our secret beach. What about the others? He asked. The others? The people we haven't seen yet. The ones that will arrive next week, next month, or next year. And the ones that will arrive after them, he said in a tired voice. Chapter 9. Escape. I watched Sal from just inside the longhouse door. Everyone was standing in a big circle, and she was in the middle, marching around and shouting out orders. The fishers had to catch extra fish for the party meal. Bugs and the carpenters had to build an eating area. The cooks had to cook 7 whole chickens. Watching Sal's skillful organisation, I wondered how she'd react if I explained to her what Jed had said. That despite all our efforts to protect the beach, other people like Zeph and Sammy would come in the future. I wondered if the thought would frighten her as much as it frightened me. When everyone had woken that morning in the longhouse, I'd pretended to be asleep. It didn't take long for them all to leave, and I was able to sit up and have a cigarette. By 8, the camp had been given their duties for the day's preparations, and everyone was busy working around the clearing. It was past 8:30 when Sal appeared in the entrance to the longhouse. "You're being missed," she said, walking up to me. "Francoise has asked me to make certain you join them as soon as you wake up." "What about Jed?" I asked quickly. "I haven't seen him yet, but I'm sure he'd like to see you too." I noticed a slightly worried expression on her face. "There was something else I was hoping you might do, Richard. You see, I know it may feel as if, with our rafters gone, our troubles are over, but I'm afraid they aren't. We still have the problem of the Swedes." She paused and touched her hair. "Now, if Christo dies during the festival, no one has to know. I think our real problem is Carl. Carl, that's right. And I'm afraid you'll have to take responsibility for him." "Me?" "Yes, you're quite right to look guilty." "Guilty? If you hadn't disturbed him, he'd have stayed on the beach all through today and tonight, and through next week as well, I expect. Of course, we'd have had to deal with him at some point, but I was planning to leave the matter until after the festival. Because of what you did, we have to act now." She gestured in the direction of the clearing. "Take a look out there. You can see how important the celebrations are to everyone here. We must make sure they go well." With a shock, I realized what she was going to ask me to do. "Let me explain the problem, Richard. Carl's wandering around like a madman, and he might suddenly appear and—" "Sal," I interrupted, "I won't do it." There was a short silence. I could sense that Sal was thinking fast. Eventually, she crossed her arms. "You won't do what, Richard?" "I won't, Sal. I won't do it." "Do what?" "Don't ask me, please." I looked at her carefully, wondering if I'd misunderstood her. But as my eyes moved to her face, she looked away, and I knew for certain I was right. She wanted me to find Carl and kill him. "I'm afraid I am asking you, Richard." I shook my head. "Sal, please. I'm going to leave the longhouse now. In half an hour, I'll come back and you will be gone. By tonight, All of our troubles will be behind us. The last month will be finished. We'll never have to think about it ever again." She stood up. "The beach is my life, Richard, but it's yours too. Don't forget that." I nodded miserably. "Good." She returned the nod, turned around and walked away. Outside the longhouse, everyone was busy in the clearing. Most people were helping to prepare vegetables. The carpenters were in the middle getting the eating area ready, all working and laughing. I easily managed to walk out of the jungle side of the longhouse without being seen. I thought of the caves after I'd looked for Carl around the waterfall. If I'd been thinking more clearly, I would have checked the caves first, but it wouldn't have made much difference. The boat had probably been gone for hours. These days, I can find comfort in the idea that my attack on Carl on the beach had cured him. I often picture him trying to guess what he's doing at this moment or that. I imagine him having a normal life in Sweden, skiing, eating, working in an office, drinking with friends in a bar. But at the time, my reaction wasn't so simple. Part of me was relieved that I couldn't now kill Carl. Most of me, however, was in shock. For the first few minutes after realising that Carl had taken the boat and escaped from our island, I couldn't even climb out of the water onto the rocks. I couldn't imagine how Sal would react to this development. What would happen when Carl arrived on Comprehension? Eventually, I managed to pull myself out of the water and sat on a rock. I didn't move again until a short while later I saw someone surface near the underwater passage. "Richard?" the head called over the sound of the waves. It was Etienne. "Are you here, Richard?" I stood up and waved to him. He swam over and joined me on the rock. After at least half a minute, he began to speak. "Richard, I want to talk to you, but I do not know." "You don't know what?" I asked. He took a deep breath. "I do not know if it is safe." "Safe?" "I think you do things. You do things for Sal. Today you were looking for Carl." I felt sick and closed my eyes. "Is he dead now?" Etienne asked. Etienne might have continued speaking, asking what I'd done with Carl, but I can't be sure because I wasn't really listening. I was thinking about the food poisoning, Sten's forgotten funeral, Christo dying in the death tent, Carl wandering around the beach, and the terrible shooting of the rafters. My mind was filling up with all these traumas, and I was hit by a wave of sickness. "Etienne," I said, hearing my voice from far away, "would you like to go home?" He didn't seem to reply for a long time. "You mean the camp?" "Not the camp. I mean home. Leaving the beach. France for you and Françoise. England for me." I turned to face him and saw the expression of hope and fear on his face. "Don't worry," I said. "Everything will be okay. We're going to leave tonight." I wasn't worried about the practicalities of leaving. It would have been easier if Carl hadn't taken the boat, but we still had the raft. If that was gone, we'd swim. We were all much fitter than we had been, and I was sure we could manage the swim to the next island again. We had water, and we knew how to catch fish to eat. I had much more serious things on my mind, like who we'd take with us. Françoise was the first person we had to talk to. We found her on the beach. Etienne stood in front of her, talking rapidly in French. After a few minutes, Françoise looked over at me with wide eyes. Etienne said something urgent, and she answered. Then he nodded quickly in my direction, and that was that. I knew she'd agreed to leave the island with us. It was a big relief. I'd been completely unable to predict how she'd react, and so had Etienne. But the other two names on our list were even more unpredictable, Jed and Kitty. Or my list, I should say, because Etienne didn't want to take either of them. I could understand that. If we had only had Francoise to take, we could almost have left at once. But over the months of my beach life, Jed and Kitty had been my two best friends, and I couldn't disappear without offering them the chance to come too. Soon after Etienne had finished talking to Francoise, she came over to where I sat. "Is there a problem?" I asked. "No," she said. "But, Richard, you do not think things can get better after the festival? Everyone says life will be better. You do not think maybe we should stay? We can wait for a few more days and then—" "The festival will change nothing, Francoise. Life will only get worse." "Worse? Worse than we have had?" "Yes." "But you will not tell me why." "I don't think I can explain, but I'm sure I'm right." "We will never be able to come back," she said. "So sad." "Perhaps," I replied, "if there was anything to come back to." She walked away, and I went to find Kitty. I'd imagined that he would be the hardest to persuade. He'd lived on the beach for longer than all of us, but in fact, he was the easiest. All I had to do was tell him that the boat had disappeared. "Oh my God! What's Sal going to say? She'll go mad! Jesus Christ!" "What's wrong?" I asked. "I was the one who tied the boat up," he said. He'd been to Comprehension in the boat with Bugs to buy things for the celebration meal. "First the dead squid, now losing the boat. She'll kill me." "Kitty, does Sal know about the boat already?" "No." "You promise?" "I promise, but she'll find out soon." "And then what will she do? I'll have to—" "Leave?" "I'll have to leave. Yes, Jesus, I should leave right now. I'll take the boat. Oh God, I can't. I'm trapped here. Trapped." "No," I replied. "There might be another way." I was beginning to feel in control. Now I only had to find Jed, tell him about the plan, and wait for our chance to escape. I was feeling so good that I started singing as Kitty and I walked into the clearing. Then Kitty started singing too. "What are you doing?" I whispered as I suddenly realised that people were looking at us. "Shut up! We've got to act normally. We don't want anyone to find out about our plan. If Sal asks you to help with the preparations for the meal, just try to be calm." "Okay," Kitty whispered, and walked off to his tent, swinging his arms by his sides. Etienne and Francoise were coping better, but they did have each other for support. They sat close to the kitchen hut, chatting and helping prepare the enormous catch of fish. Sal came up to me almost as soon as I entered the clearing. "I'm glad to see you're happier than this morning," she said. "I feel much better." "Good. I assume that means that I shouldn't worry about any unexpected problems tonight at the party." "That's right," I answered. "No problems. You can forget about him." "Forget?" Sal said. "Forget about who?" "Carl." She gave me an odd look. "Who?" "Carl." "Who's Carl?" "Carl's—" I began. Then I realised what she meant. "Nobody." "I thought you were talking about someone here." "No." Fine, Sal nodded. Well, I'd better get back to work. Still lots to do. A few moments later, she was standing in the middle of the clearing, talking to Bugs. It was after 4 o'clock before I had a chance to get to the hospital tent to talk to Jed, and a chance to do something else as well. At 4, all the preparations for the evening were finished, and Sal suggested a game of football down on the beach. This was excellent news. Keaty and I never joined in the football, so no one thought it was odd when we remained behind in the camp. We offered to stir the food in the cooking pots while the others were gone. By 4:10, the clearing was empty, and I was putting large handfuls of dope into the pots. "The cooks will notice," said Keaty nervously. "It's going to taste really strange." "If they notice, I'll just admit it was me. I'll say it was for the atmosphere," I said. "If we don't do this, the party will go on all night and we'll never be able to escape. This way, after about an hour, everyone will be too stoned to notice what we're doing. Just make sure you don't eat any of this. Only eat the chicken and rice, and make sure Etienne and Françoise do the same." When I walked into the hospital tent, the atmosphere was like in a church. The sort of atmosphere where you feel uncomfortable if you cough or move too quickly. Amazingly, Christo was still breathing. Jed's hair and beard were completely covered in blood and sweat. He didn't look at me when I came into the tent. His eyes were fixed on Christo's calm face. "Jed," I said gently, "there's something we should talk about." "You're leaving," he said. "Yes." "When?" "Tonight, when everyone's asleep or stoned. Will you come?" "If Christo's dead." "And if he isn't?" "I'll stay." "You understand that unless you come tonight, there'll be no way off the island." And the problem isn't going to be more travellers coming here. Carl's taken the boat. If he contacts his family, or Sten and Christo's families, the police will come." "Yes. And you won't be able to escape." "I know." "I want you to come. It makes no difference to Christo if you're here or not. You know that too, don't you? Most of his brain has already shut down." "He isn't dead until he stops breathing." "Okay." I thought hard for a couple of seconds. "So why don't we stop him breathing? We could cover up his mouth. It would only take 5 minutes." "No." "You don't have to do it. I'll do it for you. You could hold his hand or something. It would be a nice way for him to die. Very peaceful and—" "Listen, Richard," said Jed, looking at me for the first time. "Christo should be dead by tonight, so I should be able to come with you. Why don't you go back to the others now? I don't think Sal would like it if you were in here. But come and check before you leave," he said, and turned back to Christo. I stayed for a minute and then left the tent. The rest of the camp had begun returning to the clearing, singing, laughing, arm in arm. The party was going to start. There were 4 circles in the middle of the clearing. First a ring of candles, then our plates, then all of us, then another circle of candles. It looked marvellous and very, very frightening. Orange faces in the candlelight and clouds of dope smoke, and a lot of noise. People weren't talking, they were shouting, sometimes screaming, just telling jokes, asking for more food, but it sounded like screaming. They were all drinking heavily. The cooks had made a drink from coconut milk. You make it like this: take a green coconut, still up in the tree, and make a small cut in its base. Under the cut, hang a bowl to catch the milk. Then leave it for a few hours. When you come back, you'll find that the milk has fermented, and that if you drink it, you'll get very drunk. A clever trick. It tastes okay, a bit sugary, but okay. I was surprised I'd never seen it done before. I'd made us all sit together. That way I could make sure the others only ate the chicken and rice and didn't get stoned or drunk. After half an hour, at about 9:15, I went to see what was happening in the hospital tent. To my amazement, Jed was asleep. "Jed," I said, but he didn't move. I said it louder, again with no response. I knew this was my chance. I quickly moved over to Christo's head, pinched his nose, and covered his mouth. A few minutes later, I took my hands away, counted to 120, and crept back to the cool outdoors. And that was it. It really was as simple as that. As I returned to the clearing, I saw that several people had started dancing. It was a nice moment. Watching the couples reminded me of the way things used to be on the beach. Sal was dancing with Bugs. She looked like a completely different person. "You do not recognize her," Gregorio said to me. While I'd been killing Christo, he'd sat down in my place so that he could chat to Kitty. "No. That's because tonight is our birthday, and Sal will only get stoned once a year at this party. The rest of the year, her mind is always clear. We get stoned, but she keeps her mind clear for us." "She cares about the beach very much." "Very much," Greg said. "Of course." He smiled and stood up. "I will get her some more food. You would like some?" Both Katie and I said no. "Just for me then," he said, and wandered off towards the cooking pots. 10 o'clock. The dancing had stopped. Everyone was acting very strangely, stoned from the dope I'd put in the food and the joints they'd all been smoking. "It's weird watching them when you're not stoned," Kitty whispered to me. "They all look crazy." "It can't just be the dope," I said. "Even eating it, dope wouldn't make them as stoned as that. It must be the coconut drink." "Yes," said Etienne. "Really, I do not like this. When can we go?" I checked my watch for the 100th time. I'd thought we could leave at about 2 or 3 in the morning, when there'd be a bit of light creeping into the sky. But Etienne was right. I didn't like the way things were going either, and we could probably set off while it was still dark. "In an hour," I said. "I think we might be able to leave in an hour." But at 10:30, things started to go wrong. Bugs, who'd been sitting dreamily with Sal, drinking and smoking, suddenly jumped to his feet. His eyes were wide, and there was an expression of terror on his face. Everyone turned to look at him. "What was that noise?" Gregorio laughed. "Can you hear noises, Bug?" "It was a branch being pushed. It was somebody pushing through branches." Sal sat up on her knees. "Are we all here?" she said, looking round. "Somebody is definitely out there," Bugs said. "Maybe it's Carl," someone suggested. Several heads turned to me. "It isn't Carl," I assured them. "Jed?" "Jed's in the hospital tent." "Well, if it isn't Carl or Jed—" "Wait!" someone shouted. "I heard something. There!" We all listened. "It's nothing," Sal began to say. "Will you all relax? It's just the dope and coconut—" "It's not," Bugs interrupted. "Everyone stand up. I'm telling you, people are coming." "People?" And suddenly we were all rising to our feet, because we could all hear the noise. It was unmistakable. People pushing through branches, walking on leaves, coming our way from the waterfall path. "Run!" Sal shouted. "Everyone run, now!" Too late. A figure came out of the trees within 4 meters of us. In seconds, more dope guards appeared by his side. They all had guns, pointing straight at us. I turned to look around me. Everyone in the camp was staring at the guns, frozen in fright. I realized that escape was not an option now, and that we were all going to get killed. As I turned back to the dope guards, I saw the boss point a finger at me. The next moment, one of his men dragged me out of the circle and forced me to the ground. Shocked, I realized I was going to get shot first. First? If I had to get shot, then 10th, 11th, 12th, fine. But first, I couldn't believe it. "Ah," the boss nodded. "You the boy always come to see us. Every day, huh? You like to come see us." I stared at him in terror. Then, to my surprise, he knelt beside me and touched my hair gently. "Funny boy in trees, every day. We like you too. Take some dope, huh? Some dope for your friends." "Hurry up and kill me," I said bravely. "Kill you? Ah, funny boy. I no kill you now." He got up. "I no kill anyone now. I give you warning. You people here, that okay for me. 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, no problem, huh?" If he was waiting for a reply, none came. This seemed to make him angry. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. "You making maps," he screamed. "Maps bring new people. New people here. New people are danger for me. That is bad danger for you." Then he dropped the map on the ground and fired a shot into it. The shot missed, but it was close enough to send the paper flying into the air. "So, my friends, you listen to my warning. Next time, I will kill you all." He looked down at me on the ground and then kicked me, hard. I tried to stand up, but he hit me again. For a few seconds I was conscious, staring at his shoes. Then everything went black. I didn't know what was going on. Why wasn't anyone helping me? If I'd been unconscious, as I guessed I had, then they'd had plenty of time to come over and help me. But no one had. I finally managed to get onto my feet, and then I saw why no one had moved. The dope guards had left us with a reminder, just in case we hadn't listened to their warning. The bodies of the dead rafters. Bullets had done terrible things to them. All their bodies were covered in massive holes. Death had made them go stiff, and they were in strange positions. I don't see any need to describe them in detail. I've only described them as much as I have because it's relevant to what happened next. To have been faced with such a sight would have been bad at the best of times. Directly following the scene with the dope guards made it worse. But to go through all that while you were stoned and drunk, it would drive anyone crazy. "Right," Sal said eventually, and began to walk towards the pile of bodies. "I think we should get this cleaned up. It won't take long if we all—" The German guy was trapped beneath Zeph's chest, and his arms were hooking the two of them together. Sal couldn't make him move. We all watched in silence as she pulled uselessly at the German's legs. "What a mess," Sal said, and gave another hard pull. She fell backwards, twisting as she fell, and landed on Sammy's body. "Clumsy," she exclaimed brightly. Then she started screaming. It was a terrible sound. Bugs called her name and started crying. He ran over to the eating area and grabbed one of the cook's knives. Then he went over to Sammy and started to attack him. It began with kicking, which quickly became stabbing. In the chest, the arms, anywhere. Then he stood on Sammy's body and began pulling at his neck. Well, that's what I thought he was doing. It wasn't completely clear through the shadows, and most of the view was blocked by Bugs's back. I only saw what he'd done when he stood up. He'd cut Sammy's head off. He'd cut it off and was swinging it by the hair. And suddenly, someone else had a knife and was cutting the thin German girl's stomach open. Then someone else joined them and started work on Zeph. Within seconds, the bodies were covered with people attacking them. Looking back, I know that we could have left at that moment. No one would have tried to stop us, but we didn't move. We just stood and stared in horror as the rafters' bodies were viciously attacked. I don't know how long it lasted. It could have been as long as half an hour, but at some point I noticed that people had stopped and were sitting on the ground, exhausted. I was watching Bugs when I heard Sal's voice. "Wait on Cha Weng for 3 days," she read in a cold voice. "If we haven't come back by then, it means we made it to the beach. See you there? Richard." It took some time for me to understand. Several seconds passed in which the words meant nothing to me. Then I realised that she was standing beside me, holding the map I'd drawn for Zeph and Sammy. "Richard?" someone whispered. "Richard brought the people here." People came up, quietly surrounding me. Desperately, I began to search for a friendly face. "Etienne? Françoise?" I shouted. The others laughed. "Sal, please," I said, as I felt the first knife go into my leg. I'd been stabbed. I cried out and was stabbed again. A centimetre into the skin, this time my arm. I screamed and cried out, and then lost consciousness again. I looked around and saw Jed standing beside me, and beside him, Kitty, Etienne and Françoise. The 4 of them carried fishing spears. "You all keep back," Jed shouted. He reached down, lifted my arm over his shoulders and dragged me up. "Keep back!" And amazingly, they all did. They could easily have prevented us leaving if they'd wanted to, but they let us go. I don't think it was because of Sal, who had closed her eyes and couldn't seem to breathe. It was because they were tired. Their empty eyes told me that. Tired of everything. Chapter 10. Strange but True. I feel I should provide an account of how we all got back home, but it's going to be brief because the story's finished. We talked a lot. That's what I remember most, the talking. The first part of the journey, the nighttime journey to the raft, was silent, but it was only because we were afraid of being heard by the guards. As soon as we'd left the island and were on our way, we opened our mouths and never shut them. The funny thing is, I can't really remember what we talked about. Maybe because we talked about everything. Maybe because we talked about nothing. Because of my condition, I wasn't much help, but the others managed the raft in pairs. A few hours after dawn broke, a fishing boat came to check who we were. After a bit of chat, they took us back to Koh Samui. It was extraordinary. They didn't seem curious about what we were doing on a raft in the Gulf of Thailand. We were just another group of weird travellers to them. On Koh Samui we needed money, so Kitty and I sold our watches. Then Etienne stole a wallet. The cash was enough to get us all back to Bangkok, talking all the way. In Bangkok, the only thing left to do was to phone home. We took turns in a phone box on the Khao San Road. We were all crying by the time we'd finished. 72 hours later, we had air tickets and replacement passports from our embassies. The cuts on my body still felt bad as I was buying cigarettes at the airport. As soon as we boarded the plane, I felt okay. At this exact moment, I'm sitting in front of a computer. At this exact moment, I'm typing this sentence. At this exact moment, it's a year and a month since I flew out of Thailand. I never saw Etienne and Françoise again. One day I will. It's going to be by chance, but I know it's going to happen because the world is a small place and Europe is even smaller. I see Kitty and Jed all the time, and they see each other even more. This is strange but true. They both work at the same place. Different companies, same building. What else? About 3 months ago, maybe 4, I read in a newspaper, Britain caught smuggling in Malaysia. A few nights later, I saw Cassie, one of the girls in the camp, on the news. She'd been arrested at Kuala Lumpur airport carrying drugs. So she must have got off the island. And some of the others must have escaped too. I'm curious to know which ones. I'm sure that Bugs stayed. And Sal. I just can't stand the idea that they might turn up on my doorstep one day. And me? I'm fine. I play video games. I smoke a little dope. I have bad dreams. I carry a lot of scars. I like the way that sounds. I carry a lot of scars.